Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on powerful analytics to drive revenue and collaboration across the revenue cycle. We're glad you could join us this afternoon. I still see some people dialing in, so we're going to go ahead and give it a couple minutes here for everyone to dial in and get settled. So we will be back with you in just a couple of minutes here. Thanks. Okay, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started today. Again, thank you for joining us for today's webinar on powerful analytics to drive revenue and collaboration across the revenue cycle. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. We will be taking questions throughout today's session. So if you do have any questions that come up throughout the presentation, feel free to just drop those in the chat, or I'm sorry, in the questions tab of your GoToWebinar pane, and I will be sure to relay those over to our speaker today. So with that, I'm going to introduce PMMC and today's guest speaker, Robbie Shaw. So a little bit about us here at PMMC. We help healthcare organizations achieve revenue integrity using one of the most accurate and integrated reimbursement platforms in the revenue cycle today. Our integrated platform begins with contract management and includes contract modeling, rate setting, price transparency, and then carrying healthcare organizations all the way towards value-based reimbursement. And today's guest speaker, Robbie Shaw, is the Vice President of Revenue Strategy here at PMMC. Robbie's been with the organization for over 9 years now and has worked in various roles, including Vice President of Revenue Enhancement, and he's also worked in product support and consulting. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Robbie.
Thanks, Brad. So today we're going to certainly talk about revenue and analytics and how do we leverage them to drive our revenue cycle and revenue across our organization. But I wanted to start by highlighting the importance of revenue today. Revenue's never been more important than it is today, and that's for several reasons. But the biggest one is our costs are continuing to increase, and one would argue they're almost out of control. But our revenue itself is remaining steady and holding constant, or even decreasing in a lot of organizations. So it is becoming essential to capitalize on every revenue opportunity that exists today for us to be successful and remain stable for the future. So today we're going to focus on revenue and how to drive it throughout our organizations, leveraging analytics. To start off with, before I ever talk about analytics, I always want to talk about accuracy. Everyone's heard the term junk in, junk out. And our analytics systems are only as good as the data that we use. The data is not accurate, our analytics are meaningless. So we're going to start off by talking about 4 of our accuracy metrics and what we use at PMMC to maintain the validity of our contract management system. But the basic concepts of each of these metrics can be applied to a variety of systems. So as I go through this, I want everyone to start thinking about their systems and tools that they have in place today and where accuracy metrics may be missing or may be needed. So to start off with, across PMMC solution, the most important metric we have is calculation accuracy. What this says is assuming our contracts are set up correctly and all the data is coming in correctly, how accurate is our calculation engine? Sure, I don't have to tell anyone, but for a contract management solution, if we can't accurately perform our core function, it won't be very useful. So when you're thinking about the various systems you use today, think about, does this system accurately perform its core function? And if you don't know or don't have a metric for it, you need to start questioning, is this really performing the job it should? If you think back to when we were in high school or college taking our statistics courses, for every model you ran, even if you're using a 10% population sample, you're still using confidence intervals to assess the validity of your analysis. That same concept needs to be applied to the systems that we use day in and day out to ensure that we're driving accurate data into our analytics process so we can make good decisions. Now that we know our system is accurate, assuming it's set up correctly, the next question becomes, is it set up correctly? So we have to have metrics around that. So with PMMC, we really use 2 key metrics to assess, are we set up correctly? The first of which is contract accuracy. Did I set up my contracts correctly or configure my system correctly? System setup and configuration is one of the most difficult things to manage. It really does require looking at the output and looking at the results and analyzing the variances or anomalies to make sure they're valid. Sometimes it's tedious to do so, but the only way you know if your system set up correctly is if you actually look at it and measure it day in, day out. The other metric that we use, and now we've assessed configuration, is, am I getting all the data into my system that I expect? So there's 2 ways to kind of measure this. The main one that we use is error rates, or put another way, how many accounts have not made it into our system due to processing issues like registration errors or payer mismatches. The key with an error metric is just making sure that it's a rolling metric so that you can ensure that all data is eventually getting into your system. For us, this metric is a rolling 365 days. So if this goes unmonitored and unaddressed, the error rate will continue to climb, and we'll be alerted so that we can identify the issue and quickly fix it. Once you've established that you have your core functions accurate, you're set up correctly, and you're getting all the data in your system, the question then becomes, is it kept up to date? So at PMMC, what that means is, are all of our current contracts loaded? So what our metric is what % of contracts are loaded within 30 days of the effective date? that very quickly tells us how up to date is our system. If there are any inputs in your system that are done on a regular or timely basis, those need to be measured, tracked, and managed to ensure that you're making decisions based on the most up-to-date information as possible. So those are really the 4 key metrics that we use to assess our core function, our setup, our data, as well as whether or not we're up to date to really manage our process. And those are probably good metrics for any system, not just a contract management system, for you to be measuring in your internal business. So now that we've talked about accuracy and ensuring that all of our data is accurate, we can now talk and start talking about data and analytics. What makes analytics really useful is visualization and dynamic drill down functionality. Using real-time data visualization, a manager can view the latest figures and see the current overall activity or volume and respond more quickly to a potential growing issue. As an example, a static denial report may inform a manager that the overall denial rate with a payer is up for a particular month. However, it won't inform them on why they are up. That's why it's important to have the drill down ability that will allow the user to assess and determine the root cause quickly so that you can adjust staff or make changes to your process and address the issues in a timely manner. With the way most health systems are set up today, I'm sure you've all experienced the frustration of running and pulling a report that identifies an issue, then having to go run and pull another 2 or 3 reports to determine what the real issue was or what the cause of the issue was. With dynamic reporting, it's much more real time, allowing you to identify it quickly and solve the issue on the fly. Just to highlight the importance of visualization, there was an Aberdeen group study or survey that was conducted, and that said that managers in organizations that use visual data discovery tools are more likely to find relevant information compared to those who rely on traditional management dashboards. It also noted that managers at organizations that use visual data analytic tools are 3 times more likely to comment and share a report with their peers. And that's going to become very important as we talk about revenue strategy and leveraging analytics. So we talked about accuracy, we talked about importance of visualization within your analytics. Now let's talk about how we use them to drive revenue. One of the biggest problems health systems face today is the revenue silos within their own organizations. I'm sure each organization on the call address each of the core functional areas from contract governance to negotiations, charge master rate setting, patient estimates, value-based care. Each organization on the call certainly addresses them in one way or another. But from what we've seen, most organizations are taking a very siloed approach to this. Revenue cycle handles contract governance, managed care is doing the negotiations, finance is setting the charges, patient access and marketing are handling any pricing transparency initiatives, and then population health falls somewhere in between the clinical teams and the finance teams, but it's not really clearly defined. The problem with that is none of these departments are sharing the data between them or talking to each other, and that's very minimal if they are. In order to drive revenue across our organization, we really need to start breaking down these silos and taking a more integrated approach to our revenue. At PMMC, we view this more as an overall revenue strategy, and it's really building blocks with each function leveraging the data from the others to increase their effectiveness. So in talking about revenue, we always start with contract governance. That's kind of the core foundational building blocks to revenue these days. Oops. Sorry, I clicked. So when we talk about contract governance, we're really talking about, am I getting paid what I should be? Where am I being underpaid? Where am I being denied? How does Blue Cross compare to UHC or Aetna? What are my overturn rates or success rates? And really understanding this information is critical to moving up on the maturity matrix. Once I understand all of this information and data, I can then leverage that in my contract negotiations and rate setting process and truly understand the real value of my contracts and charges. I can start trying to shift some of my contract value away from frequently denied services to services that are paid more regularly. And I could also do the same with my charges. Once I understand my contracts and my position in the market, I can then begin to address pricing transparency. If I were to simply post my rates to my website without truly understanding my market position, I'm really taking a big gamble. And I could lose big or win big pretty quickly, but I don't think any of us really want to take that risk. Lastly, population health and outcome-based reimbursement. It's still debatable about what that's really going to look like, but most models that are out there today are still rooted in fee-for-service contracts. So contract governance is still going to be very important, especially as we begin to change our practice patterns. As think about it is, if we change our practice patterns for the Medicare bundles that are coming out, that's also going to change our practice patterns for our commercial patients. We're not going to do one without the other. So what is that real impact going to be on the commercial contracts? What's my real net revenue impact going to be? We have to start understanding that a little better. The final point I'll make about population health is that it's largely cost driven. So at some point, we're going to have to integrate cost into each of these functional areas to assess the profitability across my payers, my contracts, my service lines, as well as every other area. So if I know my labs is a more profitable area than, say, radiology, I can start to do something about that in my negotiation process or my rate setting process. So what we're going to do for the rest of the webinar is dive into each one of these functional areas and talk about how we can leverage analytics in them across each of them to maximize our revenue.
And Robbie, I'm going to pause you here. We actually had a question come in, if you don't mind answering that for us.
Yeah, no problem.
The question was, what if we're using different systems today for these 4 various functions that you just described, and is that a problem?
Yeah, so what we're really talking about here is an integrated approach, and it's really talking about not necessarily one system, but sharing systems or bringing all the data together. The problem with using different systems for each area is, one, you have to maintain multiple systems, but the biggest one is ensuring the accuracy across it. So you're really going to have to pay attention to the accuracy metrics of each one. If managed care's using one tool for their modeling and setting up contracts, and RevCycle's using another tool to run the contract governance piece, making sure both are accurate and both are feeding accurate data into your analytics tool is going to be critical. So you can certainly do it with multiple systems or leverage each system that you have in place, but bringing it all together and making sure it's accurate is the real key to it.
Okay, great. Thanks, Robbie.
Yep. So as we dive into contract governance, what we're really talking about with payer performance are underpays, overpays, and denials. But we really need to start going deeper into it. We need to start grading our payers against each other. We need to look at trends, look at our overturn rates, our success rates, re-denial rates, our dispute resolution timeframes. We need to really start digging into each core piece of our relationship with our payers, and understanding all of that is going to be essential to driving our negotiations in the future. So if I know Aetna's denying this code more frequently than Blue Cross, I can start leveraging that at the negotiation table to drive some reimbursement. So we're going to dive into a few dashboards here. This by no means encompasses all the metrics you want to look at. but it's just a few examples. This is a payer dashboard. It shows a visual depiction of the overall payer performance by payer over time. And it can show it either at the system or macro level, or you can drill down into the facility or region level, depending on your organization. Specifically, you can accurately assess and gauge the health of multiple payers by overall revenue stream. For example, average days to pay, cost centers, charges, denials, net AR, expected payments, collections, and yield. These really allow you to start assessing the overall health or performance of each payer. So these are also allowing us to quickly identify areas of concern. As an example, we can see we have a large AR bucket out here with this one payer. We could drill into this and understand, is it one service line that's causing the problem? Or if it's not one service line, when did it start occurring? Is it now? Was it last year? Or has it been just adding up over time and gone unaddressed? So this really allows us to start getting a full sense for how our payers are performing. Another dashboard that we have is a denials dashboard, and this shows the overall historical denials by payers by discharge date over time. It gives you, again, the macro level view, so you can look at it by facility or region. It shows the relevant metrics such as denied claims, denied reimbursement, denied charges, with corresponding subcategories. The point I really want to emphasize on this slide is the metrics that are important to your needs need to be measured and monitored consistently. This will allow you to quickly identify those underperforming payers and address issues quickly. So we see this bump here in November. We'll be able to catch that in November before we get to January and fix the problem. The next dashboard is very similar. It is denials by category rather than payer. Again, we have this same bump, but we can really see what is causing the issue and whether or not we're addressing it. So this is showing we're not addressing a lot of the medical necessity denials. We're addressing all of the pre-cert denials. Pre-cert denials, we're working 100% of them. We're only working 5% of our medical necessity and claim level denials. So that might be a problem we'll want to drill into and identify. So now we've talked about contract governance and the kind of the core functions around managing payer performance. That's the overturn rates, the denial rates, comparing payer to payer, the trends month over month. We can now start leveraging all of that information we've gathered in the contract negotiation phase. So in a second, we'll get into a couple dashboards.
Yeah, and Robbie, if I can just interrupt you real quick, I'm sorry. We did have another question come in related to that section. So you talked about measuring denials. How do we measure the collection process properly?
Yeah, perfect. So this kind of gets into it, this report here. You're talking about what percent of denials are being worked. But what you really need is a separate dashboard that starts grading your collection team. What we typically advise our clients to do is actually split their AR across the different collectors kind of evenly so you can create some competition and start grading your internal collection team against each other. And you'll really need a different dashboard that tells you Susie or Joe, whoever it may be, has this much in their pipeline, they've worked this much, they have this much to get to, this is their success rate, this is their overturn rate, this is the number of phone calls they make, this is the time it takes them to collect an account. Those details are really going to help you really start driving your collections process as well.
Thanks.
So as we get into payer negotiations, we again have more dashboards here. But what we really want to start with is truly understanding our overall contract value as proposed. So here we have a simple dashboard that allows me to compare my existing baseline contract against Medicare against the proposed rate structure. And I can see how they compare against each other. I can drill into the outpatient, see by service line where the impacts are coming from. But this really does give me a sense of, at a high level, how are they performing. Another way we could actually look at this is, instead of comparing Medicare, is we can start comparing our baseline, say, Aetna contract against what our Blue Cross may be for the same patient population, and against our proposed rate structure. So you can start really comparing commercial payer to commercial payer rather than just commercial payer to Medicare rates. And that really allows you to start grading the different payers against each other and see how they stack up. So we talked about drilling in and understanding the impact at the service level. We can also start understanding the impact at the outlier or add-on level. Here's the outlier dashboard. Here we're seeing the overall impact and where our outliers are coming in from inpatient versus outpatient. We can then drill in even further to understand the different service levels that are driving the outlier payment. So we can see the big impact is really coming from inpatient surgical. And if I wanted to keep drilling in here, I could go all the way down to the DRG level or even the patient level to see what DRGs and what patients are driving my outliers within that contract. Again, I'll highlight the dynamic reporting here. I wouldn't be able to drill into this data as quickly and would probably be running those 2 or 3 or 4 different reports to get to these answers. But when you're negotiating contracts, you don't have a lot of time to wait for reports. So dynamic reports become very useful in this process. And the last report we'll go over as we're talking about negotiations and simulating contracts is this dashboard that allows us to really understand where my existing contract is today, my baseline, so 51.6 million. The real value once I take out the bad debt and the denied expected reimbursement is 48.8 million. Same with Medicare. It started with 48.7, it goes to 46.0. And then the proposal, this is the interesting part, is with my proposal, it's jumping up to 52.2. My denied expected reimbursement is 0.78. Making my overall total contract value is 49.4. This will allow me to start moving some of this denied reimbursement that I mentioned earlier, taking some of the denied reimbursement that we've allocated in our negotiation process and shifting that to services that are paid a little bit more frequently or denied less frequently so that we can maximize our revenue and maximize the value of our contracts. So as we talk about negotiations, now we're going to move into rate setting and charges. When you're assessing proposed charge increases, it's important to have the ability to dig and truly understand the impact of the charges. So on this dashboard on the left-hand side, we have prior year net revenue, and then we have the revenue walk that shows us by payer how much of an increase we're getting over last year's reimbursement. And then we can see on this right chart what percentage are they increasing. The bigger the dot, the more a higher percentage revenue contribution to my overall revenue they are. So the more relevant those payers are to me. Projected change by payer is a big thing, and being able to drill into it at different levels is going to be important. But we also need to understand the charges more at a detailed level as well by service area. So we can see by service area, and then we can get into the overall charge code impact or the detailed charge code impact as well. Understanding the charge impact or the reimbursement impact of charges at the high level payer summary level is important, as well as understanding the detailed approach so that you can really start assuring that your proposed rate structure is going to deliver on your expectations. It's a very detailed process, but being able to roll it up is going to be key to understanding it and making sure that you hit your goals for the coming years. So you'll need to be able to pivot from the high-level summaries to the charge master detail to the market rate analysis and payer summaries very quickly. So now that we've talked about contract governance, we've talked about negotiations, we've talked about charge master rate setting, we're going to shift here and talk about pricing transparency and what that really means.
And before you move on, Robbie, we have another question that just came in related to the other section. So we are seeing an increase in deductibles at our organization. Does this cause the overall value of our contracts to decline?
Yeah, so that's actually a very good point. As we get into the negotiation process, one of the things, and without scrolling back through, if you the maturity matrix, one of the things that's going to be important in negotiations is what the overall patient mix for that payer is. So as deductibles continue to rise for the patients, I think the average deductible was $8,200 on the exchange. For employer-based plans, that's probably somewhere around $2,000 to $2,500, not sure. But as patient responsibility continues to rise and patients are beginning to pay for more and more of their health care, the health of that patient population financially is going to become important in our negotiations. So if we can start to measure patient payment effectiveness, how often does that patient population pay? How quickly do they pay? How much collection effort do we have to put into getting them to pay? If we can start grading Aetna's population against Blue Cross's population, it will really start helping us better understand the true value of that contract and where the money's going to come from. That's going to be real important as deductibles continue to rise, especially with the exchange programs.
Great, thanks, Robbie.
All right, so moving on to pricing transparency. What we're really talking about when we talk about pricing transparency, let's do kind of more of a level set and talk about the evolution of price transparency. The term price transparency 5 to 10 years ago simply meant presenting a patient with an estimate when they walked in the door for the service. Most organizations are already doing that today in some way or another. And the term pricing transparency has kind of taken on a new form. And unfortunately, as healthcare providers, we're not controlling that message and we're not controlling that definition. And that price message today is starting to become all about consumerism and all about allowing patients to price shop. And by now, I'm sure everyone's seen this NPR article that talks about Med Solutions rate versus Gulf Coast. And the average, the price at Med Solutions was $286 to the patient. And the price in the article for Gulf Coast was $8,800. Which, just looking at that, if I'm shopping around, of course, I'm going to go to Med Solutions. And that's what's being pushed out in the media today. So they're really controlling this price message. But as healthcare professionals, we know that top line price, that top line charge for Gulf Coast really doesn't mean anything. So as we really start breaking it down, that $286 was really driven most likely from a fee schedule somewhere around $2,300, and the allowable, the service was probably somewhere around $1,100. And then based off of the patient's perceived insurance, it would get down to $286. This is the price that's being pushed out from Med Solutions is actually the patient price. But if we look at what the patient price would be for Gulf Coast, assuming an average allowable for MRIs or CT scans, this was a CT scan, and that's probably a little bit high too. The real patient price, once you add in the deductible, the co-insurance, and the copay, is going to land somewhere around $380. So in the grand scheme of things, that's not that big of a difference. But what's being pushed out in the media is this $8,000 difference. And healthcare systems, hospitals and health systems are really being demonized due to a lack of understanding of how healthcare actually works. You and I both know top line charges really mean nothing, but that's not what's being communicated to our patients. And at some point in the near future, health systems are going to have to start taking control of this message and start changing that narrative and begin pushing out actual patient estimates onto the websites and educating your patients about what it means and how we got there. So that's a lot easier to say than do, I'm sure. And when we talk about pushing estimates out to the web, there's several factors that come into play. And the biggest one is making sure that you're educating your patients of what it means. You also need to make it easy to use, easy to find, and accurate so that patients begin to use it, trust it, and it becomes the real source that they go to when they want to understand what their healthcare cost is going to be.
And another question here, Robbie. And it's a good one related to publishing prices. How do you maintain confidentiality around rates when you're posting prices online?
Oh yeah, that's a good one. There's a lot of different ways we can do that, and it all becomes what information you push out. So the first one's probably the obvious one, and that's putting it behind your firewall, behind your patient login on whatever app, if it's MyChart or whatever it may be. So actually making the patient login so that you can see who's using it and what they're actually using it for. The other is, how much information do you want to display? Do you want to give an estimate for each facility in your system, or do you want to scrunch them all together and give an average for your system? Or do you want to give a range? We typically encourage people not to do a range, but if confidentiality is a big key around your rates, you can give a high and a low, one with major complications, one without, just to kind of give a little bit more of a range. And then lastly, another one is, it's all about what information you present. If you're presenting top line charges and then the patient responsibility piece, it's easy for people to back in. But if you take out some of that information, such as charges or the allowable, it really starts to hide some of that. It's pretty flexible with how you want to put it out there, but it is a big concern. All right, so moving on from pricing transparency, we talked about contract governance, and then we talked about how to leverage that information within the negotiation process. And we talked about pricing transparency and what it means today. Lastly, we're going to talk about value-based care and population health and what that really means. And as we talk about population health, what we're really talking about is really preparing for the shift. We can all agree, I think I said this earlier, that we're not sure where population health and value-based care is going, but we can all agree that it's coming and the industry is moving that way. And the question just becomes, when is it going to happen? So we need to get the data and the analytical structure in place now, as you elect or get forced into value-based care contracts, you have the ability to make educated decisions that won't put your organization's financial stability in jeopardy. So as finance professionals, we're going to need to start better understanding the clinical triggers and performance-based metrics that we will be graded on. We will then need to understand the financial impact of those metrics and benchmarks if we don't meet them. Today, two of the most basic performance metrics that we use are readmissions and average length of stay. And actually, now that we're thinking about it, or when you really think about it, this is a readmission slide, but another way to leverage this type of analytics is to do more of a comparative analysis and begin comparing what estimates are being pushed out and what services are actually being performed. Understanding these deviations will help you increase the accuracy of your estimate process, but it will also allow you to better understand some of the unknowns today of what patients are shopping, what services they're shopping for, and what care they're eventually scheduling. Getting creative with these analytics will help us gain a whole lot more insights into our market that we may not know today. So lastly, we'll need to understand the population dynamics that exist across our markets and payers in order to effectively understand the real value attributed to the value-based contracts. We'll need to understand what population is paying by what payer so that we can really understand the clinical outcome piece of it and how it affects each of our different populations. So in summary, we really need to start moving more towards an integrated revenue strategy to make sure that we're driving revenue across our organizations. What we've seen is that when organizations begin to leverage these historically siloed departments and leverage all of the information together, they can really start seeing some dramatic impacts on their net revenue and some dramatic increases, especially when you do it on the hospital side, technical side, as well as the professional side together. Leveraging all of this together is where you really start to see the impact. So, and we talk about kind of the key takeaways. Key takeaways would be making sure that your data is accurate, breaking down the silos, and then lastly, preparing now for the consumerism and outcome-based care that's coming down the road. With that, I want to thank you for your time. If you have any questions for me or need anything, my contact information is on the slide. Feel free to shoot me an email or give me a phone call. And I think that's all I have. I'll turn it back over to Brad.
Thanks, Robbie. We really appreciate all the insight. And at this time, we will do one final round of questions. So if you thought of anything during the presentation, feel free to enter that into the chat window, and we will answer those questions for you. And Robbie, we had one come across during that last section when you were talking about value-based reimbursement and population health. So with population health being primarily clinically driven, what really is the role of finance in all of this?
Yeah, so the big piece is understanding as we make these clinical changes, what is going to be the overall impact to our net revenue. I mentioned that as you change practice patterns for Medicare patients, you're also changing practice patterns across all your payers. So what is that impact going to be? And before you actually make those changes, you'll need to understand the financial impact so that you can work with your clinical team to make the right decision for your organization and ensure that you're going to be financially stable doing that. You can't have them shift. The perfect example is the shift from with hips and knee replacements, the shift from inpatient to outpatient care. That's always been on the inpatient only list for as long as I can remember. And as that shift, the medical necessity shift of them being really needed to be inpatient versus outpatient, as that inpatient level was no longer needed, health systems has started billing them out as outpatient services, and they started doing them as outpatient services. The problem was Aetna's the Blues didn't actually accept them as outpatient services. They were on the inpatient only list. So unless you negotiated into that contract, you weren't going to get paid for them. And that was actually a big problem health systems faced a number of years ago, and they'll continue to face if they don't get ahead of these clinical changes and identify where their pain points or vulnerabilities are in their contracts.
All right, great. Thank you. And at this time, it doesn't look like we have any further questions. So I think we're going to go ahead and conclude here. I will say that all of the materials today, the slides and recording, will be sent out to everyone here in the next day or so. And Robbie, did you want to hit on the point about the complimentary whiteboard session? I just want to make sure we get that out to all the attendees as well.
Oh yeah, one of the things we like to work on with health systems is helping them do more of an assessment of where their revenue strategy is today. What vulnerabilities do they have? What areas do they need? And we do that at no cost. What we'll do is we'll come down, we'll meet with your key stakeholders and really assess what your processes are, where you think you have opportunities, and kind of help you develop a strategy to improve your overall revenue strategy. So a strategy for a strategy, so to speak. So if that's of interest to you, please feel free to reach out to myself or Brad, and we'll get that set up.
Great. Well, thanks so much again, Robbie, and thank you to everyone for attending today's session. Again, all the slides and recording will be sent out to all of you shortly. So with that, have a great rest of your week and weekend, and thanks again.